I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching Megan's phone. My hands were trembling, and my breath felt caught somewhere in my throat. On the screen was a photo she'd hidden in a private folder. She was laughing, her emerald green dress catching the light, leaning toward a man I didn't recognize. His hand rested on her shoulder, his face partially turned away, but there was something too familiar about him. I scrolled through more pictures. Another angle, another laugh, another touch. My heart thudded painfully. Who is he? The rain tapped steadily against the window, drowning the silence of the room, but it couldn't quiet the storm raging inside me. Megan had said she was going out with friends that night. She'd worn the dress I gave her last Christmas. She'd kissed me goodbye, her smile light, almost careless. Now, that same dress hung in our closet like a ghost, mocking me. She lied. The realization hit me like a punch. Megan, my Megan, who used to share everything with me, had a part of her life I couldn't see. I remember the first time I saw her. It was at an art gallery downtown. She stood before a painting, a wild, chaotic swirl of colors. Her dark hair was pulled back, and her emerald eyes sparkled with curiosity as she tilted her head, studying the art like it held all the answers to life's mysteries. Are you solving a crime, or just trying to figure out if it's upside down? She laughed, a sound that had stayed with me ever since.
Art's supposed to make you feel something, right? What does it make you feel?
I couldn't even remember what I said. All I knew was that I wanted her in my life. And for years, she was. But now, as I stared at her phone, it felt like she'd slipped out of my grasp without me even noticing. The rain hadn't stopped as I parked my car across from her old high school. It wasn't hard to piece together the details, her vague answers, her sudden trips to the city, her carefully rehearsed stories about museums. She wasn't at a museum tonight. I saw her before she saw me. She walked briskly, her green scarf trailing behind her. My breath caught as a man stepped out from the shadows to meet her. It was him. The man from the photos. You've got to be kidding me. They stood too close for comfort. I watched as he touched her arm lightly, his fingers brushing her sleeve. She smiled, an intimate smile I hadn't seen in years. She doesn't smile like that for me anymore, I muttered, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The man, Colin, I'd learn later, leaned toward her. I couldn't hear what he said, but whatever it was made her laugh softly. The sound, muffled by the rain and distance, still managed to stab at my chest. Inside the building, they stopped in the hallway. Colin leaned closer, brushing a strand of hair from her face.
You know I'd do anything for you. Just say the word.
Colin said confidently, his voice smooth and persuasive. Megan hesitated, her voice dropping to a quieter, guilt-laden tone.
This isn't easy, Colin. You know that.
She replied, her uncertainty evident. His hand slid gently to her waist. She didn't pull away.
It could be easy,
he said softly, his tone encouraging as he leaned closer.
You just have to let it be.
Outside, I stayed in the car, frozen. Every instinct screamed at me to storm in, to demand answers. But I couldn't. Not yet. I need proof. Real proof. The rain hammered harder, drowning out everything but the crack of my breaking heart. The night was restless. Sleep didn't come, and I didn't want it to. I spent hours at my desk, staring at Megan's phone, then at my laptop. The photos replayed in my mind on an endless loop, her dress, her smile, his hand. I opened a search engine, typing Colin, New York City, finance. His face came up almost immediately, along with headlines I didn't like. Colin Harris, investment advisor, charming, influential. But there was another side to him. Stories of shady dealings, rumors of manipulation. He wasn't just some fling, he was dangerous. What are you doing with him, Megan? I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. The pieces didn't fit. Megan wasn't reckless. She'd never risk us, or so I thought. The next morning, Megan was in the kitchen when I came downstairs. She was pouring coffee, humming softly, a tune I didn't recognize. She looked up and smiled at me.
Morning. Did you sleep okay?
Megan asked warmly, her tone casual as she set the mug down gently on the counter. I hesitated, studying her closely, as though her expression might crack under my scrutiny. Not really. Late night at work. I replied, my voice neutral but edged with caution. She nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips.
Well, don't overdo it, Mr. Surgeon.
She teased playfully, the humor in her words lightening her tone.
You can't save lives on no sleep.
Her light tone grated on me. I wanted to confront her, to say everything, but the words wouldn't come. Not yet. Instead, I sipped my coffee, forcing a smile. That afternoon, I took Megan's car for maintenance. It was an excuse. I knew she kept a journal, a habit she'd started years ago to record her thoughts. It wasn't in the house. But the glove compartment in her car, it was my only lead. I found it there, tucked under some receipts and a box of tissues. The cover was soft leather, the pages filled with her neat handwriting. My hands shook as I flipped through it. Most of it was harmless, thoughts about work, grocery lists, notes about her favorite paintings. But then I found his name. Colin. You wrote about him. There weren't many entries about him, but what she wrote was enough.
Saw Colin today. He hasn't changed. The same intensity, the same charm. It's unsettling how easily he gets under my skin.
My stomach turned as I read on.
I shouldn't have agreed to meet him. But part of me wanted to. He understands parts of me Jason never will.
My grip tightened on the book, the leather biting into my palms. I couldn't read anymore. That evening, Megan came home later than usual. She placed her bag by the door, her lips curving into a soft smile when her eyes met mine in the living room.
Hey, sorry I'm late. Traffic was a nightmare.
She said warmly, her tone neutral but inviting. I watched her carefully, noting the way her shoulders seemed relaxed. She looked tired but content. Too content. Did you get to the museum? I asked cautiously, my words probing as I tried to read her face. For a moment, her smile wavered, just a flicker, but she recovered almost instantly.
Yes, I did.
She replied, her voice light and dismissive as she moved toward the kitchen.
The exhibit was amazing. You'd love it.
The faint scent of her perfume trailed behind her as she walked away, lingering in the air like a question I couldn't ignore. It wasn't the fragrance she usually wore. That's not from the museum, I muttered under my breath, suspicion curling around my thoughts like smoke. I sat alone for hours after she went to bed, staring at her journal. Her words, her lies, they all blurred together. My mind kept circling back to one thought, I didn't know her anymore. But I would. Tomorrow, I follow her. The rain blurred everything, but not enough to obscure the truth. I gripped the steering wheel, watching as Megan stepped out of the cab. Her scarf fluttered in the damp wind as she glanced around nervously, her eyes scanning the street. And then he appeared. Colin. He stepped out from the shadows near the hotel entrance, dressed sharply in a tailored gray coat. His face lit up as he saw her, and he wasted no time, closing the distance between them. You've got to be kidding me, Megan. I leaned forward, my breath fogging up the glass. Colin placed a hand on her back, guiding her inside. It was a small gesture, subtle enough for strangers to miss, but not for me. To me, it was everything. The hotel lobby was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the chill I felt watching them through the rain. Colin leaned in close to Megan, his hand brushing her elbow. She tilted her head slightly, listening intently, her lips curving into a faint smile.
I knew you'd come. You always do.
Colin said with calm confidence, his voice smooth and persuasive, a knowing smile playing on his lips. Megan shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting briefly to the side before meeting his. Her voice was quieter now, tinged with guilt.
I shouldn't be here, Colin. You know that.
She murmured, her hesitation betraying her resolve. His smirk widened as he stepped closer, the movement deliberate, almost intimate.
But you are here.
He said softly, his tone coaxing, as though the weight of her doubt meant nothing.
And that's what matters, isn't it?
Megan hesitated, glancing toward the elevator. Her hand brushed a strand of hair from her face, a small, anxious gesture I'd seen 100 times before. Outside, I clenched my fists, my knuckles pressing against the steering wheel. My pulse roared in my ears, the rain an incessant background drum. I couldn't take this anymore. This isn't happening. This isn't real. But it was real. I parked a block away and slipped into the hotel, staying just out of sight. The concierge barely glanced at me as I crossed the lobby, following the faint sound of their laughter. They were heading toward the bar. Colin's hand rested lightly on Megan's lower back as he guided her through the dimly lit space. It was intimate, possessive, and every fiber of my being wanted to tear him away from her. From my position in the shadows, I watched them take a seat at a small corner table. Colin poured her a glass of wine, his movements smooth, practiced.
To old friends and new beginnings,
Colin said, his tone effortlessly charming and confident as he lifted his glass, the faint clink of crystal punctuating his words. Megan hesitated before raising her own glass, her fingers trembling slightly as she avoided his gaze.
I shouldn't be doing this.
She murmured quietly, her voice low and conflicted, as though the weight of her words might anchor her to safer ground. Colin chuckled, a rich, intimate sound that filled the quiet space between them.
It's just a drink, Megan. Nothing more.
He said reassuringly, leaning forward ever so slightly. His smile deepened as his voice softened.
Unless you want it to be.
Her gaze faltered, and she took a sip. My stomach churned. I couldn't hear everything they were saying, but the way she looked at him, the way he leaned in just a little too close, it was more than enough. I couldn't stand it anymore. I stepped forward, my movements deliberate, my heart hammering in my chest.
Jason?
Megan's voice cracked, startled and panicked, as her wide eyes locked onto mine. She placed her glass down hastily, her trembling hands betraying her unease. Colin, in contrast, remained composed. He leaned back in his chair with the air of a man entirely unbothered, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth.
Ah, the husband,
he said, his tone calm and amused.
I was wondering when you'd show up.
I ignored him, my focus locked entirely on Megan. My voice was low, but the anger coursing through me seeped into every word. What the hell is this, Megan? I demanded, my gaze piercing hers. A drink with an old friend? Or something else? Her lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. The silence hung heavy between us as Colin's smirk deepened, his eyes glinting with smug satisfaction.
Relax, Jason.
He drawled, condescending as ever.
We're just catching up. No harm in that, right?
My fists clenched at my sides, the tension barely held in check. Stay out of this, Colin. I said firmly, the quiet seething in my voice leaving no room for argument. Megan reached for my arm, her voice trembling with desperation.
Jason, please. It's not what you think.
She pleaded, her touch light but insistent. I pulled away sharply, my gaze hard and unyielding. Then tell me what it is, Megan. I said coldly, the words cutting like a blade. Because right now, it looks like a betrayal. Colin rose slowly, each movement deliberate, like a predator savoring its moment. His eyes gleamed with satisfaction, his smirk growing wider as he fixed his gaze on me.
Jason,
he said, his tone taunting and sharp.
If you can't keep your wife happy, don't blame me for stepping in.
The words ignited something primal in me. I lunged forward, fists clenched, but Megan moved quicker, throwing herself between us. her hands pressed firmly against my chest, her voice rising in panic.
Stop it! Jason, don't!
She cried, her tone desperate and pleading. Her touch was enough to hold me back, barely. My chest heaved as I glared at Colin, his smirk now a full-blown grin of triumph. I leaned forward slightly, my voice low and dangerous. You think this is over? I said, my words cutting through the tense air like a blade. It's not. Without waiting for a response, I turned on my heel and stormed out of the room, my mind spinning. This wasn't just about Megan anymore. Colin wasn't just some fling, he was a threat. And I wasn't about to let him win. I stood on the rooftop of my office building, the chill of the evening wind cutting through my jacket. Below, the city buzzed with life, oblivious to the storm tearing through mine. My phone buzzed in my pocket for the third time that hour, Megan. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened the folder in my hand, scanning the pages one last time. Colin wasn't just a charming interloper. He was dangerous. The documents I'd found, hidden in the depths of Megan's laptop, told a story of financial manipulation, offshore accounts, and a trail of lies that stretched far beyond our marriage. You're not getting away with this, Colin. When I got home, Megan was waiting for me in the living room. Her hair was unkempt, her face pale, as though she hadn't slept in days. As soon as I walked through the door, she stood, her hands trembling visibly.
Jason, where have you been? I've been calling you.
She said, her voice laced with worry, almost pleading. I didn't answer. Instead, I pulled the folder from under my arm and tossed it onto the coffee table. Papers spilled out, financial records, emails, and enough damning evidence to shatter whatever excuses she might have. Explain this, I demanded coldly, my voice sharp and unyielding. Her eyes darted to the documents. I saw the moment she recognized them, her face crumpled, fear and guilt flooding her expression.
It's not what you think.
She stammered, her tone defensive, panicked.
I didn't know, Jason, please, let me explain.
I stepped closer, narrowing the distance between us, my voice low but cutting like a blade. You didn't know? I spat bitterly. Don't insult me, Megan. You met him. You let him into our lives. You're protecting him. Tears welled in her eyes, but I refused to let them move me.
I didn't mean for it to go this far.
She whispered, her voice breaking with desperation and shame.
He threatened me. He said if I didn't cooperate, he'd ruin us.
Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to believe her, I wanted to think she'd been forced, manipulated into this. But I couldn't forget the way she smiled at him, the way she laughed like I wasn't even a part of her world anymore. So you chose to lie to me? I said, my voice firm but laced with hurt. To hide this? Instead of telling me the truth? Megan flinched at my words, her lips trembling as she struggled to respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was cracked, broken, pleading.
I was trying to protect you. Protect us. You don't understand what he's capable of.
She said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. A bitter laugh escaped my throat, harsh and cold. I shook my head, the disbelief evident in my tone. Protect me? I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. By betraying me? That's a hell of a way to show it, Megan. She reached out, her hand brushing against my arm, a gesture that once would have softened me. But now, it felt foreign, a reminder of how far we'd fallen. I stepped back, pulling away from her touch as the weight of everything settled heavily between us. I spent the night in my office, piecing together a plan. Colin wasn't just a manipulator, he was reckless, leaving trails in places he thought no one would look. He was overconfident, and that would be his downfall. I reached out to an old friend, Adam, who worked in private investigations. By morning, I had a strategy. If Megan wouldn't expose Colin, I would. Adam sent me what I needed: emails, transactions, enough to prove that Colin wasn't just manipulating Megan, he was laundering money through shell companies tied to her name. If this blew up, it wouldn't just ruin Colin, it would ruin her. I stared at the screen, my jaw tightening. Not if I get to him first. I arranged to meet Colin at a cafe near his office. The choice of location felt ironic, neutral ground for a battle that was anything but. He was already there when I arrived, lounging at a corner table as if he owned the place, a cup of espresso balanced neatly in his hand. His smirk widened as he spotted me approaching, his confidence practically radiating from him.
"Jason,"
he said, his tone amused and taunting.
"I wasn't expecting you. Trouble in paradise?"
I didn't bite. Instead, I slid into the chair across from him and placed a small flash drive on the table, pushing it toward him. "That's everything I have on you," I said, my voice cold and controlled. "And everything the authorities will have if you don't back off." Colin's smirk faltered, just for a moment, but he recovered quickly. Picking up the flash drive, he turned it over in his hand, feigning a casual air.
"You've been busy,"
he said, his confidence returning.
"But you and I both know these things can be negotiated."
I leaned forward slightly, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "This isn't a negotiation," I said firmly, locking eyes with him. "You walk away. From her, from us. Or this goes public." For the first time, his smirk slipped entirely. His eyes narrowed, and his voice dropped, laced with anger.
"You think you can scare me, Jason?"
he growled.
"You don't know who you're dealing with."
I stood, my heart pounding, but I kept my face calm, my voice steady. "Neither do you," I said resolutely before turning and walking out of the cafe, leaving him with the weight of his own unraveling empire. As I walked out of the cafe, I felt the first stirrings of relief. The fight wasn't over, not yet. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had the upper hand. Now it was Colin's turn to lose sleep. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of my new apartment, casting a warm glow across the wooden floors. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a sense of peace. It had been 3 weeks since I confronted Colin, and the fallout was swift. The evidence I handed over to my investigator had done its job. Colin was exposed, his shady dealings unraveling faster than he could control. By the time it hit the press, he'd disappeared, whether out of shame or strategy, I didn't care. Megan, however, wasn't unscathed. The scandal didn't directly implicate her, but the whispers followed. Her colleagues looked at her differently, even her friends avoided her calls. She'd become a ghost in the very circle she once thrived in. Megan showed up at the apartment yesterday. I'd been expecting her, waiting, even. She stood in the doorway, clutching a bag of groceries like it was some kind of offering, as though carrying enough might somehow fix what was broken.
"Jason, I just want to talk,"
she said softly, her voice heavy with regret. I didn't want to let her in, but I stepped aside anyway. Not out of hope, but because it felt like the right thing to do. She walked inside slowly, her once bright eyes dulled by something I could only describe as regret.
"I've made so many mistakes."
She began hesitantly, her vulnerability laid bare in every word.
"I know that. But Jason, I never wanted to hurt you."
I stayed silent, giving her the space to say what she'd come to say. She set the bag down on the counter, her hands trembling as she turned back to face me.
"I didn't love him."
She continued, her voice pleading now, the words tumbling out in a rush.
"I was scared, confused. He used that against me. I should have told you, but I thought I could protect you by keeping it quiet."
I shook my head slowly, the weight of her words landing heavily but failing to break through the wall I'd built around myself. My voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the finality in it. "You didn't protect me, Megan," I said firmly, each word deliberate. You betrayed me. You broke us. She started to cry then, silent tears slipping down her face as she gripped the edge of the counter for support.
Can't we try again?
She whispered, her voice breaking, but a flicker of hope still lingered in her tone.
Start over?
I stared at her for a long moment, searching for something, anything, that might change how I felt. The love I once had for her was still there, buried deep beneath the rubble of her choices. But it wasn't enough. I can't, Megan. I said softly, the words final, irrevocable. I'm sorry. Her shoulders slumped as she nodded, wiping her tears with trembling fingers. She didn't say another word. She just turned, walked to the door, and left. That was how it ended, not with shouting or anger, but with the quiet, unmistakable sound of goodbye. This morning, as I stood on the balcony, the weight of the past few months began to lift. Megan was gone, Colin was no longer a threat, and for the first time in years, I felt free. My phone buzzed on the table behind me, a text from Adam, the investigator. He's done. Colin's out of the game for good. I smiled faintly, setting the phone down without replying. It wasn't Colin's downfall that mattered anymore. It was mine, my rise from the ashes of what he'd tried to destroy. Later that day, I found myself at my favorite cafe, a small corner spot with a cozy atmosphere, always filled with the comforting scent of fresh bread and brewed coffee. A book rested in my hands, though I wasn't entirely focused on the words. I was halfway through a chapter when a shadow fell across the table. Looking up, I saw a woman standing there, her expression warm and curious.
Is this seat taken?
She asked, her voice carrying a gentle kindness. I paused, taking her in, a stranger, yet something about her felt disarmingly familiar. I gestured toward the empty chair across from me. Please, go ahead, I said politely. She smiled as she sat down, pulling a book from her bag and setting it on the table between us.
I noticed you're reading the same author I am,
she said, her tone playful, the edges of her smile lifting slightly.
Thought it might be fate.
The comment caught me off guard, and I chuckled, a genuine laugh that felt foreign, yet welcome. Well, then I guess we'd better talk about it, I replied lightly, the humor in my voice matching hers. As the conversation unfolded, it was easy, natural in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. The walls I'd built around myself began to soften, and for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about meeting someone new. This was about finding myself again. The past was behind me, and as I looked into her kind eyes, the future felt like a blank page, waiting for me to write the story. Subscribe to never miss a new story and discover even more captivating tales.